Hey everybody, this is Jesse Weber, and welcome to Law&Crime Now. There has been an arrest in the George Floyd case out of Minneapolis. We have learned that former officer Derek Chauvin, the one who was in that video pressing his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck, we know George Floyd later died, he is now in state custody. We don't know at this point what he has been charged with. We have been learned this from John Mark Harrington, who's the Minnesota Department of Public Safety Commissioner. He announced this earlier today. We are going to be finding out more details as they come forward. But what is interesting, we should note as well, is that it appears Chauvin is the only one who has been arrested, and the other three officers who were involved in this incident have not been as of yet. Now, this all comes on the heels of these Minnesota protests that have erupted. As you recall, the 3rd Precinct was set on fire, and it also comes on the heels of Mayor Jacob Frey's announcement from the other day. Take a look.
Based on what I saw, is that the individual, the officer who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd should be charged. And I'm calling on Hennepin County Attorney to do that.
All right, I'm here with Law&Crime's own Terry Austin, New York Law School professor Kirk Burkhalter, and criminal defense attorney Phillip Hamilton. It's great to have everybody on board. Professor, I want to start with you. Interesting developments here. And I got to ask, what do you think led to the arrest? Because yesterday we heard a press conference with the FBI, the DOJ. They said they're not going to be pressured into making a charging decision. They even said there was evidence to suggest that there wasn't a criminal offense. There's a giant protest last night, and then bam, Chauvin is arrested. What do you think led to the arrest?
Well, I think it was a public outcry, to be quite honest. I actually wrote a piece on this today, and in many high-profile cases, the prosecution would rather have time and present their evidence to a grand jury prior to making arrests to ensure that all their ducks are in order, quote unquote. So that wouldn't have been unusual. However, here, basically you have the entire city burning. You have folks calling for the arrest. In effect, some folks believe, and myself would probably be one of them, that the family is almost being victimized the second time by having the officers out there without an arrest. So I do believe that there was immense public pressure from all around the country, not to mention the video in and of itself was quite heinous. I think had you not had that video evidence, you would not have seen an arrest so quickly.
No doubt about that. That evidence, that video is something to watch. Let me ask you, Phillip, what are you expecting in terms of charges? There's a great piece up on Law&Crime where I think it's by our very own Aaron Keller, where it discusses what are the potential charges. And there's 3 counts of murder and 2 manslaughter counts. So the way of, what are prosecutors thinking at this point? What are you expecting in terms of charging?
I mean, at a minimum, I would expect the manslaughter charge at an absolute minimum. And I think when we, as the professor noted, with just the heinousness of what we kind of see in the video, I'm not in any way surprised if we get a murder charge coming back from this as well, Jesse. We're talking about, as we look at that video right now, a knee on the back of Mr. Floyd's throat for over 7 minutes while he's in handcuffs. Just completely at that point incapacitated. And when we talk about just what we see, the argument is there that it's just unnecessary. And to the extent that it's unnecessary, it is almost rising to the level of intent. And to the extent that we start dealing with the intent, that's when we can start looking at, specifically the murder charges that Aaron has put up on the list. But at a minimum, Jesse, I expect to see that manslaughter charge come through at a minimum.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this. We heard from Minneapolis City Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins yesterday talking about how racism is like a virus and it needs to be rooted out. It was a very powerful statement. I want to draw your attention to it right now.
And so I am asking my colleagues, the mayor, and anyone else who is concerned about the state of affairs in our community to declare a state of emergency, declaring racism as a public health issue. Until we name this virus, this disease that has infected America for the past 400 years, we will never, ever resolve this issue. To those who say bringing up racism is racist in and of itself, I say to you, if you don't call cancer what it is, you can never cure that disease. And so in an effort to try and cure this disease, I am stating exactly what everyone else has witnessed, and that is racism.
Terry, over to you with this announcement of the arrest of former Officer Chauvin. You know, one of the things that I was looking out for, and one of the things that we were wondering, is why it took a delay in the filing of charges or the arrest. That's one of the reasons you could argue these protests happen. One of the analysis from our very own legal analyst has been, well, maybe investigators or perhaps the DA was waiting for the autopsy results, because while the video shows this former officer driving his knee into the back of George Floyd's neck, what was the cause of the death? And Terry, do you believe that we will learn more about the cause of death and those autopsy results in whatever charges Chauvin faces?
I do believe we're going to find out more information in the autopsy, but I do think that the arrest can easily come, and it did here, before the autopsy reports. We have a video here, and we see that this police officer refuses to remove his knee. And I do think that the murder charges, whether or not it's first, second, or third, is arguable, but I do think that those will ultimately be imposed. For Minnesota third degree, you have to show deprivation of mind and regard of less, no life. And so here, I think you're seeing that he doesn't have regard for the life of this individual. And you don't have to show that it was premeditated. You don't have to show that he was intending to do it. He just has a disregard for life, and he just refused to listen to what the crowd was saying. So I do think the autopsy is going to show more, but I do think that the video shows us what we need to know just to bring the arrest itself.
Yeah, several of our colleagues believe it might be third-degree murder. Professor, I want to go to you. We heard yesterday during the press conference this federal law called under color of law. Now, that carries with it the death penalty. There is no death penalty in Minnesota. Do you think that's one of the charges he could face?
Certainly, yes, it's a possibility. Whether or not he will is unknown at this time. It really depends on evidence. Generally speaking, that is somewhat reserved for folks in this situation, law enforcement officials who are, by virtue of their position, they're using their position to commit a crime. This leads back, it's somewhat circular, to the problem of showing that this was either intentional or with depraved indifference. It's difficult to, if not impossible, to prosecute someone under color of law if they committed an act negligently. So you have to show some form of knowledge. What is interesting here is the same council person that you just showed, according to news reports, claims that the officer and the victim actually knew each other and worked at some type of nightclub together. Now, I haven't fact-checked that. I don't know if that's true or not. But what's interesting about that is that certainly could go towards the argument that there was some intent here. It's easier to prove intent if folks tend to know each other. However, this is a problem with cases involving police officers. It's quite often very difficult to prove that they intended to cause the death of another, as opposed to acting in some type of reckless or criminally negligent fashion.
Well, look, we're going to keep on covering this because this is such a major story, but I do want to bring our viewers' attention to something else. There's another big legal development happening. On Tuesday, Law&Crime is going to be offering you live coverage of the oral arguments of the appeal of convicted murderer Scott Peterson. This is huge. This was the trial, or one of the trials, that helped to define the true crime era. Now, as you know, Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson, and their unborn son, Connor. And now, under appeal, he is seeking not only a reversal of his death penalty sentence, but his convictions as well, wants new trials for each. Phillip, want to turn to you first. This is interesting because one of the main arguments, which we believe is going to be argued, is that it was unfair for the court to excuse jurors who in their juror questionnaire said that they objected to the death penalty, when in fact they said also, But that doesn't mean we can't go forward with the death penalty if we hear all the facts and all the evidence. Your thoughts on that argument that these jurors should never have been excused because, in other words, the defense is saying you only picked jurors that were totally in favor of the death penalty, and that's not fair.
I mean, whether it's Scott Peterson, and it's interesting that you say that in the terms of like how much that case defined the true crime era, how much attention was put on that case. The fact of the matter is, whether it's Scott Peterson or whether it's Joe Blow defendant, they have a constitutional right to a jury of their peers. And to the extent that those peers were excluded, whether it was fraudulently, whether it was in any other manner that did allow him to have a fair and impartial jury, then there are some constitutional issues there that clearly the California court, the Supreme Court, has to take up. They have to take up. And so I think when we sit and look at these arguments, it's going to be interesting to determine how far the court takes it in terms of whether we have a violation of federal law, whether we have a violation of California constitutional law. We'll just have to see.
And Terry, another big argument that the defense is going with is that this trial should have been moved, I believe, from San Mateo to Los Angeles, that the pretrial publicity was absolutely crazy. I think they cited in their brief that almost half of the potential jurors thought that Scott Peterson was guilty even before the trial happened. Do you think that that is grounds, that's a good argument and grounds for a successful appeal?
I think it's an argument, but I think it's an argument that ultimately will not prevail. You could state in opposition to that no matter where you took this case, jurors or potential jurors would have known about it. It got so much publicity across the United States, and some would argue even across the world. So I don't think that the publicity issue on appeal is going to prevail. I think that as long as you can show the judge and the court and the attorneys did the best they could to pick individuals who said they would be fair and that publicity would not affect their decisions, I think that's about the best that you can do here. It's going to hard. It would have been hard, I think, to isolate the case completely.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you want to follow this, and I tell you, you don't want to miss out, Tuesday, 4 p.m. Eastern, that is going to be our live coverage of this. We're going to have a pre-show. We're going to cover it live. It's going to be me, Michael Bryant, Dan Abrams, and others to break down this really monumental case. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk more about the arrest of former Officer Derek Chauvin in the George Floyd case. We have learned that he is now charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. Third-degree murder and manslaughter for the person who was in that video pressing his knee on George Floyd's neck. A lot to discuss. Back from this break. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody. An arrest has been made in the George Floyd case. That former officer, Derek Chauvin, who was in the video pressing his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck. He has been arrested, and now we've learned he has been charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. This comes after a press conference from Mike Freeman, who's the county attorney here. We're going to get into that in a second, but the timing of this can't be ignored, that the arrest and charge of this officer came after massive protests last night, including the 3rd precinct being burned down. Mayor Jacob Frey held this press conference in the early morning hours when he was actually reacting to a criticism from President Donald Trump about how he's been handling this. Take a look.
There was an earlier one calling you a radical leftist and a weak mayor, and to get things under control, and I have it here. I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city. A total lack of leadership, says the president. Either the very weak radical left mayor Jacob Frey get his act together and bring the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job done right. That was the first of 2 tweets from the president.
Well, let me say this. Weakness is refusing to take responsibility for your own actions. Weakness is pointing your finger at somebody else during a time of crisis. Donald Trump knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. We are strong as hell. Is this a difficult time period? Yes, but you better be damn sure that we're gonna get through this.
Mayor, some people have questioned whether you made a conscious decision to let people go into the 3rd precinct and offer it up as kind of one of these healing spots that you had referenced earlier in the day. Is that how you were approaching it?
No. The decision that I made was for the safety of our officers and the safety of the public. The symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life.
All right, the mayor there taking tough criticism and some tough questions about the actions from the early morning hours. Professor, I want to go to you now. 3rd-degree murder, manslaughter. Now, we know that 3rd-degree murder carries up to 25 years in prison, but based upon these definitions, under the law, what does that tell you about the state's position on what happened to George Floyd?
Well, these are 2 actually very different charges, and it's kind of it's somewhat of an argument in the alternative. So either this happened, or if you don't find this happened, then that happened. So with regards to 3rd-degree murder, under Minnesota law, that's the depraved indifference standard. So the prosecution would have to prove that this police officer knew of this unjustifiable and unreasonable risk, and in still taking this action, show the depraved indifference of some type to human life. The other side would be the manslaughter charge, where that knowledge requirement is not necessarily there. It's more of a negligence standard. It means that you should have known and you disregarded it. Depraved indifference charges historically are just not run of the mill, and there are a lot, they tend to be difficult to prove. The criminal negligence charge, I think, is something that would be a little bit easier to prove. That doesn't mean that they couldn't prove it, but it's 2 very different stances. So what it shows me is, I would suspect the prosecution is covering all their bases. They want to make this argument, and both arguments. However, as we're so early in the investigatory process, as all the evidence unfolds and the autopsy report, and you're fleshed out whether these parties actually knew each other, and you have to look at the training and the number of complaints this police officer had, that will unpack what direction this will go in, I believe.
Phillip, are you surprised that not all the officers have been arrested and charged at the same time? Right now, it's the main perpetrator of this, but what about the other officers who look like they aided, or at least in the certain sense prevented, other people from getting involved in trying to save the life of this man? So they haven't been arrested or charged as of this recording, as of this broadcast. What does that tell you?
What it tells me is that I think the initial focus, as we've kind of discussed, is just trying to figure out, both from whenever we got the autopsy results up and until now, I think clearly the focus has been the officer whose knee was actually on Mr. Floyd's neck. That's where the crux of the investigation has occurred. There's nothing stopping, the prosecution from moving forward at some point with potentially trying to figure out some kind of whether you want to call it an accessory charge or what have you, in terms of whatever charges ultimately, this officer is indicted for. However, I think in not being surprised that those officers haven't been arrested, that we're just dealing with, frankly, the focus of the investigation, and the focus of the investigation as of right now has finally been arrested.
Terry, let me ask you this. We're dealing with a situation here where we're trying to understand what the next steps are. In terms of a defense, now that he's been charged, I was wondering what could his defense possibly be? And if you look at the video, if these officers believed that Floyd was intoxicated and that he really was just lying or mistaken or making up a story about he couldn't breathe, is that a viable defense, that they didn't realize the danger that he was in?
Jesse, as you usually state, that is the million-dollar question. I don't think that this officer is going to be able to claim that he thought this victim was resisting arrest, that he presented any sort of danger. The video itself is 100% clear. We are watching 10 minutes of our victim on the ground with people around saying, please let him up. Floyd's nose was bleeding. He couldn't breathe. He called for his mother. So I don't think that the police officer, he might try to claim that he thought this was resisting arrest, or that he was in danger, or that some of the other police officers were in danger. But I think that argument will fail, or in my opinion, it should fail before a jury.
Well, there's a giant spotlight on the police department, and the Minneapolis police chief had to answer some tough questions over this week. Particularly, was it the police's fault in saying perhaps that George Floyd resisted arrest when the evidence so far doesn't seem to support that conclusion? That just led to these protests and led to this anger. Listen to his response.
Some people have said they thought the wording of the original police statement varied greatly from what we saw in the video, and that compounded to the trauma. Why did we see a discrepancy there? How did that occur?
I've heard the same thing. I do know that at the time the incident occurred, there was a lot of information that was developing and changing, and so I have heard that, and it is never certainly my intention to put out information that would cause some of the pain that others had felt, or even doubt some of the information that was coming out. And I'm committed that as we move forward, that we will do better to make sure that we're getting as much factual information out as a timely manner as we can.
Do you know where that initial information came from? Was that from statements from officers at the scene? Was it from some other source of information?
Unfortunately, I don't have all the details to that, but I'll get back with you on that.
Professor, I want to turn to you. With your law enforcement background, you have a police department that is quite controversial over this past week, from the video itself to, as you just heard, this information being put forward, the evacuation of their own precinct last night, and even videos that have surfaced of them with the state police arresting CNN reporters and a team. What is your reaction to the response or the actions of this police department?
Well, the first thing I thought of was Ferguson. If you recall that incident and the aftermath, the Justice Department came in and effectuated a very thorough report of the police department and was able to point to various forms of breakdowns and chains of command and culture that existed that certainly was not effective and did not promote active and clear and decisive law enforcement. I would not be surprised if we see something similar to that here. And this is not an indictment of the chief or all the police officers in that particular city by any means. However, when you look at this video, what is disturbing, and I think what folks are going to focus on and what the police officials have to answer for, not only are the actions of the officer who had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, but the other officers who stood by and had their hands in their pockets and did nothing. And to Terry's point, not only was this being filmed, but people, the witnesses, people in the crowd were telling all the officers, they said clearly, look, He is
And
bleeding from the
They couldn't do
nose.
anything. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't rush and save his life as much as they wanted. They were literally blocked by these officers and at one point threatened with mace. Sorry to cut you off, Professor. Phillip, thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Phillip. Appreciate it. We have to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to focus on the latest in the Ahmaud Arbery shooting out of Georgia. Stay tuned.
When the case first broke, Shanann and Cece and Bella were simply missing.
Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now.
Something in your gut was telling you that he had something to do with it.
Chris Watts thought that he could go to the police department, knowing the fact that he killed his family.
Why should I believe you? Because I'm a very trustworthy person.
Breeze through a polygraph test.
You intend to answer all of the questions truthfully.
Yes.